So, how do you balance having a public profile in the social media age with being a government official? Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy. My name is Crispin. We have a program here aimed at aspiring and current government officials, those that are interested in public policy or influencing government decision making. And I've spoken previously about being a public official trying to navigate a public life in the social media age. It is an incredibly vexing and challenging issue because there is an expectation, long-standing, that as a public servant, you can implement faithfully government policy as it's directed by the government of the day, that you are impartial, you'll give good advice to the government, irrespective of who you would have voted for yourself, and that the public has confidence that the people they elect are having their policies implemented by professional public servants. So your public commentary is a big factor in supporting or diminishing that relationship. Okay, it's very important to have that covenant between you and the minister and you and the public that you are able to carry out government policy as a functionary. Now, this is all well and good in theory, but in the social media age where everybody is online, including public officials, it's incredibly challenging, and there just isn't any good guidance around that, where things can happen that are beyond the control of individuals. So where do the lines be drawn between, being a citizen, which a public servant has every right to be, to give their views on various subjects of public importance without diminishing the role of being a professional and implying that they're unable to carry out government policy. So to that end, for the first time, the Australian Public Sector Commission has released guidelines this week on this issue. And it mirrors closely what I had said before about my principles, but it does take things a little further. And I will give this about a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. There are some things that I really like in it, and it is better on balance to have this document than to not have it. Every public servant should read it. Even if you're not in an Australian public service, I think it's quite useful. I'll leave the link in the description. But there are also things that I think are significant shortcomings, and the good does not take away from that. So we'll go through it, and I'll start with the things I like and then the things that need to be improved. The things that I like are that it has a good preamble about the fact that you do have rights as a citizen. All public servants do have the right to participate in their public life as a democracy. And I will read out, that sort of statement. Australian public service employees have a right to participate in online society just as they have rights as citizens of Australia to engage in community life. APS employees are entitled to private lives, personal views, and political opinions. These are entitlements. These are rights. But at the same time, there are those obligations to protect and uphold one's standards of professionalism as an impartial public servant capable of carrying and implementing government policy. One is seniority. The more senior you are as a public servant, the more cautious you have to be and conservative you have to be in your public commentary, right? Because it becomes much harder if you are responsible for a whole agency, for members of the public, the media, and the government to make a distinction between your personal views and your professional views, right? So, and that could actually even be a signal to people that are who are your employees within the department. If you say something that is inconsistent with government policy, then the public agency might differ from public policy because they'll tend to follow their leadership. So that's very important. If you're a senior public official, you do have to be really thoughtful about how you're perceived on Twitter, on Facebook, and in other places. The good news of this is that once you reach those levels, I think the vast majority of public officials have already been institutionalized to those cultures and ways of working. and understand the need for upholding the integrity of the relationship between agencies and elected officials, and are less likely to make those kind of blunders, right? But nevertheless, I think it is a good thing to put at the top of the list to say, look, there is actually a balance of responsibility. If you're a junior official coming into the public sector, there's going to be more tolerance of mistakes as a general rule than if you're someone who is at the highest levels, accorded significant levels of public accountability and responsibility. The next principle they give, and is the one that I like the most, in part because it aligns with my own. If you refer to my previous video, there are two principles that I have followed throughout my entire life to maintain both a public sector career and a public profile, and that is never comment publicly on the level of government that you work for, which is if you work for a state government, don't talk about your own state government jurisdiction. Maybe talk about other jurisdictions, certainly talk about the Commonwealth, but don't talk about your own government that you work for, like even necessarily in the positive, just because you don't want to create that sense of perception of bias or that you are critical of your own masters, right? And the second principle, which is the same what they refer to, is don't comment too much on the portfolio that you work in. If you work in, say, health, don't talk too much about health policy on social media, because that will give the strong feeling that you have a bias in how that policy is implemented related to your own work. And that is much harder for media, for other people, for the government to make the distinction between your personal views and your professional life. It's an unfair thing to do to an agency and to the government. And so what they've said is very similar to that, the connection between the topic and your work. So, the more related your public commentary is to the work you're doing, the less likely it is that you can make a distinction, and therefore the more likely it is you're impugning your ability to faithfully carry out public policy as it's determined. Okay. The next one I'm ambivalent about. I think they need to have more clarity on this one, which is the sort of the nature of the expression, i.e., if you make public commentary where you write a long essay slandering the minister, perfectly understandable that would call into question your ability to be professional. But they also talk about liking things on social media, being tagged by others in various articles and whatnot, being cited in certain publications, things that are often beyond your control, which I think is completely beyond the pale, and secondly, things that are at best minor or may not be your intention or indicate actual support. So if you're anything like me on Twitter, scrolling through, you have Butterfingers, you like all kinds of stuff, and you don't even really think about it. I don't think that is a reasonable standard, and to include those kinds of examples undermines the credibility of the document as a whole. I do think that there is a standard whereby you should only focus on the commentary that you actually make. If you share a article with commentary that says, hey, look, I love this article, I agree with everything in it, and it completely slanders the government, yes, I get that being a problem, right? But if you just like something that someone has said on Twitter, then that's not a risk that should be burdened on the individual. That's just a part of everyday life. The thing that I actually am also quite ambivalent about is the final principle, which is the extremity of your views, right? So they sort of say, look, the more extreme your views are, the more likely it is that you're undermining your professionalism as a public official. And I want to make the distinction between that being related to your work and just your extreme views in general, because it's a separate principle. If you are making commentary related to your job and you're very extreme about that, then of course that's relevant. But if you just have personal views that other people might consider extreme, then that's not really relevant for the public sector unless it directly contravenes public sector values or is illegal, right? So let's say you post something with all kinds of racial expletives and and you talk about, all kinds of your hatred of a particular group of people, well, of course that is inconsistent with public values, and therefore, an agency would be right to question you on that, right? But let's say, for example, you just wanted to stop all immigration, right? Full stop. Irrespective of whether they were investors, business people, family migrants, refugees, whatever. That was just your personal view. Well, I would consider that fairly extreme. Most people would see that as an extreme position, but it doesn't really call into question your ability to be a public official unless you happen to work in immigration policy, right? I think they need greater clarity on that, because there is a certain personal space, as they said in their preamble, you have a right to be in political life, that separates you from it. And I also think that would be something that would be subjectively applied. So let's say you're an avowed communist, right? Well, I would also consider that to be pretty extreme. But would you face the same consequences at a different end of the political spectrum if you had those views in the public sector? So again, I don't think that would be a fair standard to apply. I don't think it's relevant for a public sector officials' profession. And so I do encourage the Public Sector Commission to look at that. Then there is the thing that I think is the most destructive part of this document, and I actually think it's completely unintentional, because the Australian Public Sector Commission, like the rest of us, are trying to navigate this incredibly complicated space where they've got these 20th century, 19th century values of Westminster impartiality of the civil service versus a rapidly changing social media age where the balance of personal preference has moved from privacy to exposure, right? Everyone's online. Everyone shows their view. That's the transformation of our culture. And so marrying that up is incredibly hard. But one thing they've said is they've put all this on a spectrum of risk, low risk behavior to high risk behavior, which means that everything you do on social media, according to this, has an element of risk, right? And then you have to ask the question, risk of what? And the strong implication there is that a risk that you're going to call into question your ability to be a public servant. You're engaging in risky behaviors. And I don't think that is compatible with democratic rights. So they've said in their preamble, you have a right to be a democratic citizen, to be part of the public discourse, have political views, but everything you do on social media carries an element of risk. That is not compatible. If something carries risk, then it's not a right, it's a privilege. There might be risk, but a lot of that risk has to be carried by the public service, not by the individual, right? So what you do is you have boundaries. You say, okay, well, if you speak on issues publicly related to your work, then you are doing that with an element of risk. That's fair enough, right? Because you are legitimately calling into question your ability to be a public official. And therefore, on that spectrum, there's low risk to high risk behaviors, okay? But if you are commenting on things unrelated to your work, and let's say the media comes along and takes it out of context or blows it up to a massive story, connects it to the fact that you're a public official, the public agency gets, attacked, that's an unfortunate event. Okay, but that shouldn't be borne by the individual. That's no risk to that person. That is just a product of being in a democracy where things happen. And it would be unfair to suggest that if something happens as a consequence of your social media behavior, even within reasonable guidelines, even within what anyone would say is the rights of that individual, that the negative consequences of that needs to be borne by that individual's career. That's not a fair standard. And so I think they need to clarify that. As I say, I don't think it's intentional that way. I just think that they don't know. They're sort of covering their bases a bit and say, look, things can happen on social media. It carries an element of risk. There are higher risk and lower risk behaviors, ergo, just keep that in mind. But I do think that if something is a right, then there is no risk to that individual for exercising that right. And if everything has risk, then there are no rights, there are just privileges. So do consider that. That would be my feedback to the Public Sector Commission. My feedback to the rest of you would be, follow this advice. Don't follow my opinion because I'm not the one setting the rules. Definitely have a read of it yourself because it is actually quite useful. They do give some good examples, which I won't go through here, but they're really, really good. Leave your comments down below. Where do you see the balance between a public sector official's role and their private life? If you find value in this conversation, do like and subscribe because we talk about this sort of stuff constantly. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Thank you.